You should have the slides.
Where would they be?
Well, they're going to be up on these two screens, and they should be up down there too.
Okay. And how would I change? Oh, there's like a clicker.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think they should be. This slides go up when he starts talking. All right. Welcome everybody. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to dive right in. Seth Stephens-Davidowitz is going to talk about his new book, Everybody Lies, long subtitle, for about 15 to 20 minutes. After that, Seth is going to sit down. We're going to have a conversation with Andrew Gellman of Columbia University and Harry Enton of 538. And we will viciously attack Seth and the book he has produced. Seth will get the opportunity to defend himself, and then we'll take some questions from the audience and follow that same procedure. All right, Seth, want to go for it?
All right. Are there slides? Oh, okay. Thanks, Dan, for the introduction and for inviting me to this panel. And this is a book, Everybody Lies. It's about 5 years of research I've been doing. So I'll describe what it is. And for the last 80 years, if you want to know what people want, why people did the things they do, what people are going to do, you have basically one main approach. You ask them. You conduct a randomized survey. So Gallup or Pew or Quinnipiac will go out and ask people questions. And there's a main problem with this approach, which is that people tend to lie to surveys to make themselves look good. So if you ask people immediately before an election, are you planning to vote? The overwhelming majority of Americans in a survey will say, sure, I'm going to vote in the election. They don't want to admit that they're not voting in the election. It's kind of considered socially unacceptable to not vote in an election. My favorite example is the General Social Survey asks men and women in the United States how frequently they have sex, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual sex, and whether they use a condom. So you can do the math on this. And American women say they have sex about once a week and use condoms 20% of the time. That means they use 1.1 billion condoms every year, American women in heterosexual sexual encounters. American men, you ask them the same question, do the same math, they say they use 1.6 billion condoms every year in heterosexual sexual encounters. And you can kind of see, if you think about it for a second, those by definition have to be the same, right? So we already know that somebody's not telling the truth, that somebody's lying. So who's telling the truth, men or women? Neither. According to data from Nielsen, which tracks every condom sold in the United States, only 600 million condoms are sold every year in the United States. So basically everybody's now lying about how much sex they have. Men are just lying more than women. And I think, generally we've relied on surveys because that's the only thing that we've had. But I think we now have a new tool to understand the human psyche, which is the searches people make on Google. And that's the stuff I've been researching for the last 5 years. And the idea behind this is that people are very, very honest on Google and will tell them things that they might not tell to anybody else. They'll confess things to Google that they wouldn't tell to friends, family members, surveys, maybe even themselves. So why are people so honest on Google? I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that you have an incentive to tell the truth to Google. So if you are someone who doesn't usually vote in an election, you don't have an incentive to tell a pollster the truth about whether you're planning to vote in the upcoming election. But you have an incentive. You probably need information on voting. You may not know where a polling place is because you don't usually vote. So you have to search in the weeks before the election where to vote, how to vote, polling places. And you can see very, very clearly in the Google search data that people that search, when search volume in an area for voting information is high in the weeks leading up to an election, turnout is going to be high in that area. So no matter what people say to pollsters, you can actually see based on the searches they make whether they're actually going to vote. That's kind of one reason that people are honest on Google, and it makes the most sense. It's the most intuitive, that you have an incentive to tell the truth because you need information. The second reason that people tend to be honest on Google, which is more surprising, and one of the more surprising things I learned when I started doing this research, is a lot of people just confess like full sentences to Google with no obvious reason why Google will help. So you see searches on Google for I hate my boss, or I'm happy, or I'm sad, or I'm drunk. And you kind of go, well, why are people telling Google this? And I think it maybe relates to the tradition of, in Catholicism, of the confessional. There is something about just saying things, and people seem to use Google in big numbers to just say what's on their mind in almost a complete sentence, which definitely I was not expecting at all when I started this research, but has definitely caught me by surprise. So what can we learn when we look at these searches? So if you remember in the 2008 presidential election, all the way back then, Barack Obama was elected president. He defeated John McCain, and there was a big question after this election: did race matter in the voting? Did people care that Obama was black when deciding whether to vote for him? And this is kind of a classic question that could be complicated by social desirability bias. If you ask Americans, the overwhelming majority of Americans, 98 or 99% of Americans, say they don't care. They didn't care that Obama was black in the election, and that was kind of why a lot of people concluded that we lived in a post-racial society back in the day. There was this idea that that voters voted for Obama, and they said that they didn't care that Obama was black. So could you use Google searches to potentially, because people are so honest, because people tell Google things that they might not tell anybody else on socially unacceptable attitudes, could you use Google searches to get the real answer of the effect that race may have played in people's voting decision? So what I did is I made a map of racist search volume on Google. And this is the percent of Google searches that include a very, very charged racist word. I won't say it out loud, but you can kind of guess maybe what it is. And the first thing that struck me about this data first was how common the search was. So in the time period I was using, people are making these searches, these racist searches, in about the same frequency as they were searching Lakers and migraine and Daily Show and Economist. So it wasn't by any stretch of the imagination a fringe search. These are mostly for jokes, mocking African Americans. That's kind of the big theme of these searches. The other thing that struck me about this map is it looked very, very different from the map I would have expected of racism. So if you had asked me where racism was highest against African Americans in the United States, I would have guessed that racism is predominantly concentrated in the South. If you think of the country's history, the Civil War, slavery, we think of racism as having a strong North-South divide. And definitely racism is highest. Some of the places it is highest are in the Deep South, places like southern Mississippi and southern Louisiana. But you can also see in the map with darker red, meaning a higher frequency of these searches, that it's also higher in many places in the north, in western Pennsylvania, in eastern Ohio, industrial Michigan, upstate New York, rural Illinois. I think the real divide this search data reveals is not north versus south, it's east versus west. You see that it's much, much higher east of the Mississippi River and then kind of drops pretty substantially west of the Mississippi River. So once I had this map, I wanted to see how you could, because people are so honest here, could you use this data to measure how much Obama really lost in the 2008 election? And of course, you can't just compare racist searches to votes for Obama, because it might be that places that have high racist searches would have opposed any Democratic candidate in 2008, so that wouldn't be really a fair comparison. So what I did is I compared Obama's vote total to previous Democratic candidates, such as John Kerry in the previous election, who was a white candidate and was ranked similarly liberal. And what you see when you do that, and you can read the paper, read it in the book, is a very, very strong, significant relationship that places that had highest racist search volume, these places in Appalachia or places in industrial Michigan, support Obama much less than previous Democratic candidates. And you can start controlling for anything you'd like. You start controlling for education or demographics or political views or cultural views, and nothing changes the relationship that was a big factor. And overall, I conclude that Obama lost about 4 percentage points from racism, which was much higher than you'd get from really any other measure. And he got about 1 to 2 percentage points from increased African American turnout. So this paper kind of languished in the academic world for a little bit, and then very recently, when the Trump phenomenon was starting, that Trump was saying a lot of racially charged, making a lot of racially charged comments, and people were questioning how is he doing so well, even when he's saying these things that you're not supposed to say, and was racism driving some of his support? And Nate Cohn of the New York Times asked me for the data on the racist search volume. He had data on support for Trump in the Republican primary. And he said of all the variables he could test, whether it was age or education or economics or trade exposure, the single highest correlation he could find was the racist search volume for Trump. So this, of course, does not mean that everybody who supports Trump is racist, but it does mean that some of his supporters were, and that it did drive some of his progress in the primary. And I think there's really just all kinds of things that you can do with this data, and I talk about them in the book, whether it's predicting turnout or measuring child abuse. You can even measure in this data, or I've done data on do-it-yourself abortion, and pretty much all very depressing topics. So this book's kind of really depressing and horrifying, but I put a lot of jokes in so you wouldn't notice. But I think there is a lot of value to knowing these parts of the human psyche that we don't aren't usually talked about. So I'll kind of give one more example of the research I've done. If you remember the San Bernardino terrorist attack in December 2015, when two Americans with a Muslim American name shot up their coworkers at a party, and right afterwards, as soon as this attack happened, almost within minutes, you saw a huge spike in really nasty searches about Muslims. The number one search about Muslims immediately after the San Bernardino attack was "kill Muslims," which is another one where it's not like clear what people are looking for Google, but people do just express these random thoughts on Google. So they search things like "kill Muslims" or "Muslims are evil" or "I hate Muslims," and they really were getting out of control immediately after this attack. And 4 days after the San Bernardino attack, Barack Obama gave a speech to the nation, basically trying to calm down some of this Islamophobia, because he wanted to address kind of these attitudes that were getting out of control. And it was a nationally televised speech. It got a lot of attention. It was covered by all the big news outlets. And the speech was, I'm probably, unlike a lot of people in this room, I'm an Obama supporter, but I found this speech like just totally beautiful and spectacular, and like Obama at his best. And he talked about how it was really moving, kind of a sermon. He talked about how it's a responsibility of all Americans to not give in to fear, to appeal more to freedom, that it's our responsibility to treat everybody the same, no matter their religion. So it was a moving speech, and all the traditional sources really, really loved this speech and gave it great reviews, whether it's the New York Times or the LA Times or other news organizations. It was all, great job, Obama. You really hit this one out of the park as far as kind of explaining to people why they should not give in to Islamophobia. So I decided you can break down Google data minute by minute. So I decided to see what happened to these searches for "kill Muslims" and "I hate Muslims" and all these kind of angry searches as Obama was speaking. How did they compare before the speech, during the speech, after the speech? And I did the comparison and found that not only did these searches not drop as Obama had hoped, they didn't even stay the same. They skyrocketed. Basically, everything Obama was saying seemed to just totally backfire as far as calming this angry mob. And there was, so this was kind of, this is kind of surprising. There was one line, though, that Obama did give that seemed to have a different response, which is Obama said that we have to remember that Muslim Americans are our friends and neighbors. They're our sports heroes, and they're the men and women who will die for our country. And as soon as Obama said this, you see very, very clearly on Google this huge spike in interest in this statement, that for the first time, the top descriptor of Muslims on Google was not Muslim terrorists or Muslim refugees. It was Muslim athletes, followed by Muslim soldiers. And these searches stayed up for about a week afterwards. And I think you can kind of compare most of the lines in that speech about responsibility. They were a lecture, they were a sermon, they didn't tell anybody anything they didn't already know. And you compare that to the line about athletes and military heroes. That was provoking curiosity, offering potentially new information. So we wrote this up in the New York Times, our analysis of the speech, and I don't think it's crazy when you write an article in the New York Times that some powerful people will see that, including people in the president's office, because 2 weeks later, Obama again gave a speech about Islamophobia, this time in a Baltimore mosque. And he basically stopped with all the lecturing and the sermon. He didn't talk about how it was anybody's responsibility to do anything. He instead really doubled down or quadrupled down on the curiosity strategy. So he talked about how Muslim Americans are athletes and soldiers, but he also talked about how they're farmers and merchants. And he said that Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Quran. And he said that Muslim Americans built the skyscrapers of Chicago. And this speech also got a lot of attention and also was on on national TV. And you do see that many of the searches immediately after he made this speech actually did go down. So you saw a drop in searches for kill Muslims and I hate Muslims in the hours following his speech. So that's just two speeches, and I don't say that that's a science of how you calm down Islamophobia, but I think it does show the power of this data, that you could maybe turn something as seemingly unpredictable as how to calm an angry mob into something like a science. And obviously more research has to be done, but now we have minute-by-minute data on these people that are not necessarily, they're a small number of people, these people who make these searches, they might not be picked up by a survey, and they're probably not going to agree to come into Princeton or Harvard to participate in a laboratory experiment, but they do make these crazy searches on Google, and we can use this data to potentially understand how do you calm down an angry mob, and that a lot of the things that we thought worked probably don't work, and a lot of the times we pat ourselves on the back for these great speeches we did, they may just be backfiring. So that's kind of the theme of this book, that there's so much that we can now learn about people from all this data that's on the internet that didn't used to be there. And I think now I'll take the attacks from the other panelists.
All right, thank you, Seth. Yeah, so we're going to have a conversation about the book. Not the entire book is about politics. I'd say it's a relatively small part of it. Surprisingly large part of the book is about internet porn. So we're going to touch upon, I think, a bunch of topics that were not necessarily in the opening presentation. But so I very much enjoyed this book. Some of the jokes are a little corny, but that's what you get. But I wanted to first give Andrew Gelman the opportunity to share his initial thoughts on the book and some of the things you appreciated and perhaps thought were deeply misguided.
I think maybe some people will take some lessons from Seth's presentation and learn the science of stirring up an angry mob. So maybe it's too bad that he happened to have done that, but too late for that to discuss that any further. Today I got here, I came here a little bit early and went to the Museum of American History, where they had an old directory, I'd say a telephone directory, but it was from the 1800s. So I guess it was just an address directory from Philadelphia. And it had each person, and for the men in the directory, it had their profession. There was a captain, a presser, a shop, it just said shop, lab, cooper, an agent, a gent, I guess that was a gentleman, a gardener, an attorney, a printer, a milliner, an alderman, a cordwainer, another cordwainer, a gunsmith, someone whose occupation or business was listed as shoemaker's tools, a baker, and a turpentine distiller, and a few others. It made me realize that there used to be a lot of available data, and everybody used to kind of know everybody. So in some sense, what Seth is saying, look, now we have this source of data that we didn't have before, and look how much we can learn. Well, maybe part of that is there's a feeling that we need to learn about such data because people are harder to know about. 100 years ago or 200 years ago, you maybe didn't need a lot of polling to find out how people would vote. You would just ask the neighborhood precinct captain how many people they could get out to the polls next month, whatever it is. So I think it's good for us to have a historical perspective about this. Regarding Everybody Lies, I had a couple thoughts on this. One is that as a person who does use a lot of opinion polls, I'm actually impressed at how honest people are. I always tell people that if you want to find out what people are doing, the best idea is to ask them. Now, you won't get it completely right, so 60% of Americans vote. Maybe 70% will say that they were planning to vote or that they voted after the election. I mean, certainly more people plan to vote than actually vote. It's not lying if you say you plan to vote and then you decide not to because something comes up. After the election, they ask people if they voted, and a few percentage points more, a few percent more say they did than actually do. But it's not that far off. When you ask people who they plan to vote for, they're very good. The polls are very accurate. Hillary Clinton had 52% of the two-party vote in the polls, and she actually got 51%. The polls were off in some states, which I do not think the evidence does not point to people lying to pollsters. The evidence points to differential non-response as explaining that. Now, the clue to why is it that people are so honest in polls was given by Seth when he talked about motivations. Why you should respond to a survey in the first place, that I have no idea. I don't respond to surveys. I think it's ridiculous. Someone's trying to make money off of me. Like, why should I spend 45 minutes answering somebody's questions so they can? I mean, that's silly. I'm not going to do it. But if you're going to answer a poll, you might as well be honest. In some sense, the whole point of answering the poll, a political poll, is to say, yes, I support her. I support him. In the 1950s, it was a little different. In the era of the Gallup poll, not that many people were surveyed. If you were surveyed by Gallup, you'd be one of 1,500 Americans. Your vote would be counted. It would be in the newspaper the next day. 51% of Americans think, whatever they talked about in 1951, 1950s, like think we should bomb China, whatever it was, whatever your attitude was, you would have a big impact. And it was very rational to respond to polls. Not so much anymore. If you're going to respond, though, you might as well tell the truth. Maybe not about how many balloons you use when you're having sex or whatever. I think maybe people might be misremembering, too. Like sometimes you don't remember exactly everything that happened in the past year. But when it comes to voting, I'd see no reason to think people aren't sincere. It's kind of interesting because there's this question of what is the true self? Is the true self like the person who Googles? Is that who you really are? Or I don't know about that. That's like you don't spend 24 hours of the day Googling either. Who you are when you're Googling racial jokes is not necessarily your truth either. That's just another aspect of who you are. But the really interesting question is, what's the incentive for Seth to tell the truth? So when someone gives a talk that says everybody lies, it raises a certain paradoxical element to it. And that Seth, I think, does have an incentive to get things right, in the sense that if he gets things wrong, then people like me will pick on him. And of course, also, I think Seth has the goal of discovery and would like to learn things. I'm very interested in this idea of data journalism. It's become very important. We have a data journalist.
Oh, God.
Let's say we have 3 data journalists on this panel right here. Data journalism is playing a large role in my personal life and in the life, you could say, the life of our society. We've had a lot of discussion recently in science about, can we trust science just because something's published in a top journal? Should we believe it? Like a journal like Science or Nature or Lancet is like a brand name. Now we see this in data journalism. A site like 538 or the New York Times has to be very careful, and when they make mistakes, they tend to correct themselves. Other sites are just sort of out there trying to get hits. Journalists like Malcolm Gladwell, I don't think he lies, but he makes a lot of mistakes. I don't know that he has such an incentive to get things right. Apparently, he doesn't seem to have such an incentive to get things right. In fact, I think he may have an incentive not to ever admit he got anything wrong. Now, for me, I've made enough mistakes in my career, like I'm already wet, so I don't mind being dunked in the tank one more time. So it's some sense, probably it's good for us to make mistakes first. Like, we used to have this saying about politicians back in the Clinton era that it would be great if they could first send the politician to prison and then let them out and govern the country. Because first, then we wouldn't have a suspense of when are they going to get caught and all that. And second, they would have much more of a sympathy for the ordinary person having been in prison for a while. So I think maybe it should be a requirement for every data journalist to make some big mistakes right away, get that out of their system. And so maybe Seth will save those big mistakes for his second book.
So, Seth, what do you think? Is the value of this kind of organically generated data mostly limited to people's most private activities, and beyond that it doesn't add much to what we already knew?
Well,
How much did you lie while you were standing there?
No, I think I'm a compulsively honest person.
I see. You would.
And the only reason I would have called it Everybody Lies except for me. But I already had a long enough title.
I see.
I think I say that, so with the voting, they've actually done recent studies. These people have catalysts when they compare people's, individuals who said they voted and individuals who didn't say they, and their actual voting behavior in surveys. So it is true that people exaggerate their voting for social desirability bias, but there's also now a growing problem with surveys, which is people just give weird answers. They just answer kind of randomly. So there are a lot of people who voted and say they didn't vote, which is really, really bizarre. And I think that actually played a role in some, Andrew and I have actually talked about this before. I'm going to write a column about this. I think this played a not trivial role in some of the reason that the polls were off. In the previous election, kind of random answering, which is becoming a bigger problem with a growing problem with polls. But I think Andrew and I kind of have like a definitional difference on what constitutes lying. So I think Andrew thinks it has to be kind of conscious. You have to be consciously aware that you're deliberately that you're deliberately misleading a survey. And I think I think people can lie to themselves, and I think that is an important part of it. So I think if you ask people why they did things, then they will frequently not really be consciously aware of why they're doing things. And I think there are certain areas where surveys are pretty good. Everyone obviously wanted me to make the book about how the polls were horrible in the 2016 election because it would sell more books. I think that's probably one of the areas polls are best at, but I think a lot of areas they're not very good at. When you ask other things, people are not good at predicting what they're going to do in the future. They lie to themselves a lot. They're over-optimistic. People are not good about explaining the reasons they did things, and people are not so honest with admitting some of their desires. So I think there are definitely this one area of who you will vote for an election that's been studied over and over again by polls. They're okay at it, although they're having these new problems. But there are definitely, I think, a lot of areas where surveys are going to kind of become a smaller and smaller part of understanding the human psyche relative to some of these sources I talk about in the book.
Harry, what do you think? Do you? I want to ask you. Do you want to comment on the book in general, and then please tell us what you where do you see
I'll say
the state of surveys?
I'll say a few things. Number one, I thought the book was very well written. I think that there's oftentimes a lot of people who write about material that can be difficult to grasp for people who aren't familiar with statistics. And to me, this book was very easy to understand. It was, you open up with a story, I believe, about your grandmother, if I'm not mistaken, about who you should meet, who would be a good person. You need someone to meet with humor, and I just thought that was a very good opening, and you can get very much into it. In terms of the book itself and the idea of using Google and figuring out our true selves, I will say first off, as a quote-unquote data journalist, God help us all, that we are using Google more and more. We certainly use Google Trends to figure out what's popular in the public, what is going on in terms of, let's say, a Republican primary where you had all these guys that were running, and then we were trying to figure out who is going to perhaps come up and be the main challenger to Donald Trump in a given state. And we found that Google Trends had a pretty good understanding. If people were searching for that candidate more in the final days, then that was to us a sign, hey, maybe that guy might be on his way up. But certainly it's the case that we weren't using Google Trends in isolation. We were using it with the context of understanding the horse race at large. And I don't think we're at the point yet, at least on the political side, or anything that has to do necessarily with understanding the percentage of Americans who believe X, Y, and Z, that we can then say that's the percentage that believe X, Y, and Z based off of Google searches. And so I just don't want anyone to think that that's possibly the case. I'm not saying you were making that case. I'm just saying that that's certainly something that's going on. One of the things that I wanted to ask you was, I love that map, the 2008 map, the change in vote from Kerry to Obama, and then you obviously used it on Trump. But it also seemed to me that map was somewhat, although I'm not familiar if you've done this yet, correlated with how the vote then changed from Obama to Clinton. It seemed to me that there was certainly some correlation where Clinton she basically did even worse in a number of areas that Obama was already trending bad. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not because people were racist. They could be racist, and that was why they were changing their mind, but it could simply be, it wasn't that they were racist against Obama, it could be the fact that now racial views are increasingly correlated with how people vote, whether they vote for the Democratic or Republican Party. So I think that's another thing that we have to keep in mind is, this is a thing we always talk about, correlation is not causation, right? And I think that continues to be the case. In terms of using Google and, is this a truth serum? I don't know. I Google a lot of strange things, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, who's on the cast of Who's the Boss? I mean, these are the strange things. Does that mean all of a sudden I'm the biggest fan of Who's the Boss? No, maybe I was just interested in it for a particular reason. So again, I just think that Google on its own can give us a keen understanding of what's interesting to Americans with not necessarily assigning a given thought of, okay, why are they necessarily searching that? And then the final thing that I'll say, which I think was, and I think I emailed you about this, was there, the book is not all about politics. There's, a specific thing about sports and being a Met fan versus a Yankee fan. Was it Facebook data? I can't remember. Yeah, it was Facebook data that you used for that. And I think that, this is the type of thing where, in fact, you can use surveys that actually replicate the findings that you see on Facebook so that we know, for instance, I had done my own research which showed that in New York there's obviously two baseball teams, the New York Mets and the New York Yankees, and what the surveys have indicated is that the Mets tend to become more Met fans when the Mets do better, and then when the Mets do worse, there are fewer Met fans. And a finding that was put in the book is something pretty much along the same lines, which is that people who were, 8 years old? 8 years old when a particular baseball team's doing well, all of a sudden there are a lot more fans of that particular franchise. And I think that's the type of thing that can also be very interesting and cool to use this data for, because conducting polls, although are getting cheaper with new online surveys, a lot of people don't necessarily know how to ask those questions or don't necessarily have the ability to go out and conduct a survey, and using this type of data can help confirm poll data or perhaps make a new finding on perhaps something that's more trivial, but may in fact be interesting to a number of people.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, so not totally, because I think that, so that example is you can measure how much basically how much a team's winning a championship when your every year of your childhood affects the probability that you like a team as an adult.
Yeah.
So you'll see, for example, that the Mets have a lot of fans who were born in 1978 and 1961 because they were all these men were boys when the Mets were 8-year-old boys when the Mets won a championship. And you can see this across a whole bunch of teams that, you kind of see that when a person's 8, it's obviously not perfect, it's somewhat noisy, but when a kid is 8, they have a lot more fans. But the point of that study is the value of big data, that in a survey, so I don't think you can replicate this in a survey. You can see that in a survey, a small change over time, that like you can compare Quinnipiac survey when the Mets are doing, now they're doing a little better, when they've been doing okay, now they're doing a little worse again.
I get the point.
But you can see the changes over time. But to really see that type of subtle pattern, you need like data on how many Mets fans are there among men born in 1978, and how many Mets fans are there among men born in 1979 and 1980. And you need this for every single team. And you could never see that in a survey of 1,000 people or 2,000 people. So the point of that chapter is that these big data sources, you can really zoom in to tiny populations and you still have a big sample. So because Facebook has everybody, they have samples for any year and any team combination. They're going to have a big sample for that, whereas surveys aren't going to do that.
But
so
that
do
works
study.
because Facebook basically covers everybody, as you're saying, right? And so in the book, you cleverly also work in some papers based on the full population of tax returns, right? Obviously, that's not sort of that's more like the census from 1810 in a way than the internet sort of organically generated data. So I can see how if you have the full population of people that you're interested in, you can do these granular things. That's very different from the Google data, where we have no idea of how representative searches are. We have no way really to look at subsets except for on some geographical level. And we have no real baseline we need to pin that. We can compare things over time, but it's hard, as Harry was saying, to find out what percentage of people is actually going to vote for Trump based on searches, just because we don't have a way to know what absolute levels mean, as opposed to relative levels, which are more meaningful. So those are two very separate types of data.
I just wanted to insert that there are questions that we demand less or more precision from. So it's actually not hard. You can actually use just like crude search data to find out, like to predict elections pretty closely. Like you can get it within 5-10% just by looking at who people are searching for. On the other hand, predicting the election within 5 or 10% isn't going to be that helpful. If you want to know like what proportion of Americans are, using balloons when they're having sex or whatever, then being off by 10% isn't such a big deal. So a lot of it has to do with, I think a lot of the success of Seth's work is that he's getting away from the trap of saying, I want to answer the question everybody else is answering. So like the thing about the racist searches, okay, so yeah, it's not a representative sample. What if it's off by 10 or 20%? These are still huge differences. And a lot of the questions are like that. So I think it has to do with asking questions that are not, where you're not demanding that level of precision sometimes.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's one of the troubles you might know. So one of the most famous examples of using Google searches is Google flu. And scientists could predict, they tried to predict the rate of flu in the United States in a given week based on people are making searches for cough or runny nose or flu or whatever on a week. And it kind of blew up a little bit. And one of the problems with Google flu was that our flu models are really, really good. You can get really, really close by just assuming that flu is going to be the same as it was previous week. So that like you have an R squared of 0.95 or something. So then, and Google data is always going to be, as Andrew says, I totally agree, somewhat noisy. It's never going to be perfect. It'll probably get better as we learn how to weight it and more methodologists study it. But it's still going to be, it's not a perfect data source for obvious reasons. So it became hard. So basically, there's a question whether Google can really beat just a simple model of that's been well developed for many years. But I think there are certainly areas in health. So I always say that Google constipation makes more sense than Google flu, because then you would have had basically no information on what's going on in the United States. And then the noise of the Google search data still is going to beat the kind of nil information we currently have, or close to nil information we currently have. So I agree with Andrew's point there.
Are the CDC people doing that? I mean, do you know?
About like different health conditions?
Yeah, are they doing, I mean, you know, they have people at the CDC who have some time on their hands, like they might be doing Google constipation, right? I'm just curious, I thought you might know, like, you know.
I think that after the Google flu thing, when the Google flu thing came out, there was a lot of excitement, so they started doing Google dengue fever in developing countries, and they did a lot of things. Then the Google flu thing had a little bit of a blow up, and everyone kind of lost a little bit. I think it lost a lot of momentum.
I think one of the things that's going to be interesting as we go forward, as I kind of hinted at in my last answer, is that surveys are becoming less and less expensive, at least on the entry ground level. So, you know, everyone can conduct a SurveyMonkey poll. And I'm going to be interested to see, you know, how Google searches along with SurveyMonkey searches, how all this quote unquote big data that's cheap or small data that's cheap can be used together to figure out certain things that is going on. Because I think, you know, if we just have, right now, most of the surveys that we're conducting are with these, you know, larger surveys or telephone surveys, and that to me is obviously, to everyone, it's very expensive. But as we sort of get down and people are starting to form their own surveys, and it's not just an expert like you who understands everything that's going on, that's where I think we could get very interesting things happening, because at the end of the day, what's most interesting is not just what we can find once we determine what we want to find, but coming up with those questions in the first place, which is exactly what you were saying, which is the questions are most important. What is it right now that we are not asking that this data can get to us? And I'm just interested. I don't know the answer to that.
What is the answer to this? Do you know?
What
are questions that we should be able to, that we cannot currently answer, where you see a role for this kind of?
My current obsession is anxiety, because I've done a lot of research. So I started just doing research on where anxiety is highest in the United States, and I thought it was going to be New York City and like urban intellectuals and Woody Allen types, and it's not true at all. Like anxiety is highest in Bangor, Maine, and it's higher in Kentucky. And generally in rural areas and places with lower levels of education. That actually is not just Google search data that you would see in surveys as well, but I just didn't know that. But then because you have this rich data, you can actually see how anxiety changes over time. And you know, so one example is when do people search for panic attacks? Like not surprisingly 3 a.m., right? But now we basically know, due to this data, we know how many people, to an approximate degree, how many people are having a panic attack in New York City on any given Tuesday evening, and how many people are having a panic attack in Washington every Tuesday evening, and how many people are having a panic attack in Boston. So then you can basically say, okay, well, what happens in that day? What happens leading up to that causes, is it just random that every day some people have a panic attack and there's nothing to it, or there's some clear events in the day or 2 days before they cause a panic attack?
But this is assuming that a constant fraction of the people suffering a panic attack Google's panic attack.
I think if you have a panic attack, you Google it.
Automatically? Okay,
I mean, I think there are certain situations where that's not true, but I think if you wake up in a panic attack, it's probably pretty likely to get to Google.
I see.
I think that's another example. I think we have to break some of this data down. So you can say with health conditions, and a lot of people have criticized my book because they're like, I search for all these health conditions. I'm a doctor, or I'm a researcher, so I search for these things. I don't have them, and that's probably true. I think it's, in general, these research searches are pretty small percentage, that it doesn't usually overwhelm the data. But then you could really dig down. I don't think too many researchers at 3 a.m. are searching for panic attacks. I think you have a pretty good idea that if someone's searching, so you can really, so this data in some sense is blunt right now, but it could get a lot better. And a lot of the problems we have with it, if we got better, we could really take out the people who are searching for other reasons.
I think that's fair. And so I just want to go back to the earlier point. So I know Andrew can predict the presidential election within 10 points pretty comfortably based on search data. But I mean, there are places, of course, like Google and Facebook, who have much more of an opportunity to link data within person and granularly over time. What kind of uses would you see of that kind of data? What kind of risks would you associate with those databases existing? Because that's a very different level of quality of the data than sort of more aggregate data on search behavior.
Yeah.
You talk a little bit about this.
So one of the studies I discussed in my book, which is not my study, which is a study by Microsoft and Columbia researchers, and they studied pancreatic cancer. They used Bing data, anonymous and de-identified over time. So they had the same users making searches over a many-month period. And then they said they could...
When you say anonymized, do you mean they know who's searching, they just aren't looking at the actual name of the person? Like they're linked to...
Yeah, they link, but they don't know who it is. But then they said, okay, someone probably has pancreatic cancer if they make a search like just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And that's probably another one where you get it. If you get a diagnosis like pancreatic cancer, you probably turn to a search engine because it's such a big event in your life. And then they said, all right, so here are people who, anonymous people who we know have just got a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer in this month. And then here are some people who are similar to them and never got a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. And they have these users over time, and they said, what were they searching in the months leading up to that diagnosis? What symptoms were they searching? So what symptoms are predictive that you're going to have pancreatic cancer? And they found these really subtle patterns that indigestion followed by abdominal pain is a risk factor for pancreatic cancer, whereas indigestion by itself is not a risk factor for pancreatic cancer. And if you're anything like me, you're going to go home and convince yourself you have indigestion followed by abdominal pain tonight. But that's like a really, really subtle pattern of symptoms, right? And I actually talked to the researcher. Doctors don't know. Like, our system of diagnosing diseases is not as sophisticated of having a huge group of people and following a time series of symptoms and finding which ones predict stuff. I think that's almost a revolutionary type of medicine. And the advantage of pancreatic cancer is if you are told that you have pancreatic cancer, the earlier you are told, you can dramatically improve your odds of surviving. So then the ethical question is then what should happen if the search engine figures out that you have pancreatic cancer, that you have a chance of a 20% chance, 25% chance, a 15% chance, should you be told that? And I think yes, like you should be able to opt in, but if I had a pattern of symptoms that gave me a risk factor of a disease that could be cured, I'd want to know about that.
The problem in your case, it sounds like you're inflicting most of the symptoms on yourself by reading about them and then convincing yourself that you struggle through them. So that's obviously a problem we'll have to deal with. But this method you talk about in a variety of spots in the book about sort of matching people to most similar cases, both on Facebook and on Twitter and through their health records. Why is that not and especially in the healthcare sector, that seems like an important innovation. Why do you think those methods aren't coming through as rapidly as they could?
So a big problem with health data is a lot of the data is not linked together. So the data is kind of all over the place, and there's not a huge incentive for people in health to put the data together. So a lot of people have kind of been trying to go around the official healthcare organizations and stuff to try to collect their own data.
Because this is one of the things that people should keep in mind as they read about these things, right? A lot of the stories are about things like baseball, politics, and porn. Mostly because of the data availability. I think it's not that there's no applications outside of those realms.
Well, those are the three topics I'm most interested in.
Oh, I see. I was trying to come up with a generous explanation for why the entire book is about those three things, but apparently not. Harry, so you guys use Google search data when you try to make projections.
Sort of.
But not really. What is that the main source of this type of data that you use? Where do you see these things going? Where have you guys moved beyond survey data?
Sure.
Without revealing any.
Well, there's no trade secrets that are going on. We all have access to the same Google, unless y'all are part of a secret club that I'm not aware of. The way that we use Google, at least one of the ways that we've certainly used it, I'll give you an example, is figuring out, for instance, what was the effect of WikiLeaks during the final month of the campaign? Did, in fact, that harm Hillary Clinton? And what I had found using that data was that, in fact, there does seem to be some correlation to when people decided they said they were going to vote for Donald Trump and when searches for WikiLeaks, in fact, jumped off. And if anything, if you look at the national exit poll, it might actually be a stronger correlation than when James Comey decided to send his nice little letter over to Congress. And I don't think that WikiLeaks really got asked all that much in terms of after the election of what was that the big effect. I think a lot more people were concentrated on Comey, but in fact, the Google data perhaps suggested otherwise. And that goes back again to, I think, the question of, were Americans being asked about WikiLeaks in their polling? Perhaps not as much as you might have thought. And also, one of the things that I think survey data is sometimes it's more difficult to get at is, why are people voting the way that they are? Survey data, polls are very, very good at predicting who's going to win and who's going to lose, regardless of perhaps what some people might argue. But what they're not as good at is assigning reasons for why that's occurring. People often give weird answers. Oh, I was thinking that the entire time. I was certain. Oh, that had no effect. Oh, blah, 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 blah. And then you look in the polling data, it didn't, either changed or didn't change, which was in direct contradiction for the reasons that they gave. And again, I think this goes back to the question that both of you were sort of tangling with, is I don't necessarily think it's that people are lying. It's that people honestly don't know what it is that kind of pulled them in one direction or another. It was finally this thing that helped put them over the top. So I think that's certainly one example of where we're using Google data. I think, again, I mentioned this before, the other thing where we're using Google data is tracking changing minds in real time. And in general elections, most people make up their mind, a few months before the elections. Very, very few people are going to change. But in fact, in primaries, people are much more likely to change their minds at the final seconds. And that's where Google Trend data is specifically useful. The other thing I'll also add is that there are a lot of races in which we don't have polling data for. We are talking about presidential elections right now, and there was, how many polls came out a day in a presidential election? About 15,000. It was ridiculous. You could find a poll that said anything that you wanted. I'm sure there was a poll out there that had Evan McMullen somehow winning the presidential race. Or Gary Johnson, although that might have just been people who were high at the time. But there are many fewer polls for lower down races, for races, for House, for Senate primaries. And we might get a very good idea. I have not seen, any large-scale studies on this, but I'm very interested to see, as more and more people are turning to the internet, whether or not these Google Trends can be applicable to understanding who has momentum in a Senate or a House primary, so that somebody like myself, who might otherwise be like, I have no clue who's going to win, hey, maybe it is so-and-so who has a particular chance. And for me, those are most of the applications in politics. But again, as you said, this is just such a small part of the book. To me, there are many more applications in places where perhaps polling isn't as vast, whether it be sports, whether it be health, or whether it might be a topic as interesting to me. I'm a huge fan of entertainment. I think we all are, even if we perhaps otherwise argue that we're not. And there was this whole story about Brad Pitt, appearing on a magazine cover this past week, and he had this story, and Brad Pitt seemed a little sad. But I would be interested in seeing whether or not people read that story the same way that the mainstream media or those members of the press read it. I think that's a particular place where we can get outside of the bubble. I think one of the main lessons of this presidential election is we all kind of live in this bubble. We're all in Washington, D.C. right now. I took the Acela Express down from New York today. You can't get any more elitist than that. And I'm particularly interested in, can we in fact use this Google Trend data to figure out certain directions where the public is thinking things that we might not otherwise think and that we'd never think of asking the polling data question about?
As opposed to the current situation where you only know how Bill Kristol feels about it.
Well, Bill Kristol has a terrific sense of humor. I will give him that much on the Twitter.
No, I was saying on the Acela Express.
Well, on the Acela, fun little story was I wasn't sure which line necessarily was going to be my entrance, and I just followed Rick Tyler, who was Ted Cruz's campaign chief. I was like, that guy looks like he probably knows where the train's going to end up going, even though there's no sign up. He was exactly right.
Anyway, the true thoughts of the people. I'm going to open it up to the audience, unless, Seth, you want to say something before you're going to get guided in other directions. Any and all questions are welcome. Please, we're going to start up front here. Please hold for the mic, and please briefly introduce yourself. And ideally, questions end with a question mark, but rants are welcome as well, as long as they're short. But please hold for the mic. Yeah, right here.
Hello, yeah. My name's Julia Abrahams, and I just came out of general interest as a member of the public. I wanted to know, surely there are commercial companies who are developing methods for going through all of this data because they want to know things to sell. You know, they have a strong motivation to make money by tracking people's behavior. Are there methods that the commercial entities are developing that you all could use to, deal with politics and psychology and pornography? Although I guess that's a commercial interest.
Well,
Many types.
I think your former employer is heavily active in this industry, but Phil, you want to go ahead and talk about this a little bit? And
Yeah,
about,
I guess,
about your attempts to make money in the stock market as well, maybe?
Oh yeah, there's definitely a lot of use of this in marketing. I think marketing is one area. So I've been talking to people, they're stopping using surveys. They used to ask people like what products they're going to buy, and they say they don't correlate very strongly with what products they actually buy. So I don't know why that's the case if they correlate with voting more.
I think this gets back to what are the competing sources of information. So in an environment where you have very little idea who's buying what, then maybe a survey is going to provide information, because otherwise all you know is who's selling what and nothing else. Amazon now, of course, they know so much about who buys what. They know about what I buy and so forth. So that creates less of a value for them. I mean, you can just find out directly what people are buying. You don't need to ask them, right?
Yeah, but what they're going to buy in the future, I guess, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's always going to be harder to know what people are going to do. I just think they're better. They're very good data, like from Amazon and other companies.
And of course, most of the ads you see on the internet are based on all of your on the previous actions that Google and organizations like that are aware of. So if you're in Gmail and you see an ad, they'll be the ads you see will be partially determined by the content of your emails and the things you've searched for, to some extent. Same for Facebook. So that's I think the most obvious commercial application.
Well, so then I talk about in the book as well. One thing that tech firms do a lot is they do rapid experimentation. So they basically, I think Facebook now does more experiments in a day than the FDA does an entire year, which is they can basically just very, very quickly divide their users into a treatment and a control group. And they can show different groups different versions of the site. So they can put in, change the font or change the typing or change the wording and see which one gets people to be on the site more or click more or do whatever they want more. And I think that is kind of your question of how we can kind of researchers utilize these tools. I think that's something that's underutilized in academia, where the experiments in academia are still, you recruit a bunch of people over a long period of time, and it takes months to set up, and you do a small experiment, like 1 or 2 small experiments over 30 or 60 people. And I think where academia can move is they can use some of these digital tools to run 1,000 experiments as part of a paper and say this is what we found, and more. And I think that would make science move a lot faster. But I haven't seen that done at all.
Let's go over here, middle of the table, Jonathan.
I'll talk later. I'm a little skeptical, but.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Fall, also here just for my general personal edification. I'm curious, you spoke about weighting Google data. How is it biased? Obviously there's going to be a class and age bias built in, but when you're looking at a Google trend for the US, are there any unusual ways we perhaps don't think of intuitively that it is biased? Again, not representative of the general population.
There are a lot of random situations that you just find when you do it more and more. So one of the things I found is I was doing all this research, and using Google Trends data, and they frequently correlate with census demographics, what people search. So people, so African American is searched more in places with high African American populations. Like, not surprising, but if you do these over and over again, one thing I found is that DC tends to be an outlier. And I think one of the reasons is because the residents of DC are different from the people who make searches in DC, right? That a lot of people who don't live in DC commute to DC and make searches. And that's kind of just one of these issues that like come up in a data source like this that I wouldn't have thought about beforehand, but does come up. So there really are a lot of issues. I think it's unfortunate. I think initially there hasn't been too much methodological research on this topic, because I think a lot of people, survey people were very skeptical of the data source, but that's starting to change, where Pew just did a beautiful study on using Google search data, and they have like these hardcore methodologists who are much more detail oriented than I am, and have like pages and pages of things they found in the data. So I'm hoping that more and more people, methodologists, start studying this data and find a lot of these biases and ways that you might weight it to make it better.
Let's go over here to Bill Gill. Sorry, Harry, did you?
I was just going to say, although, as you were basically suggesting, on the Democratic primary side, I found the data to be pretty much useless, because Bernie Sanders was like 9,000 trillion searches ahead of Hillary Clinton in every single state. I was like, okay, didn't really tell me much, but yeah.
Bill.
Hi, Bill Gale at the Brookings Institution, and former employer and co-author with Seth. So I'm not lying, but I am biased. So first, one comment, one question. The comment is, I thought this was an incredible book, really well written, really interesting, really funny, and really insightful. And the question is, baseball, porn, and politics are all interesting and fine, but I thought the most interesting part of the book was the stuff on child abuse, because kids can't just talk about it, and there was sort of the sense that they're going on Google and saying, why does my daddy hit me, and that it just seems like an incredibly powerful mechanism, something you obviously can't get from a survey. And you mentioned in the book that you were working or consulting with some governments on that. I'd just be interested to hear more about what's happening on that.
Yeah, so that there is a disturbing element to some of these searches, and one of them is that kids do, obviously these are not like younger kids who don't speak or use the internet, but older kids do make searches like my dad hit me or my mom beat me, like really, really depressing stuff, kind of going to this point that people just typed sentences into Google. It's obviously really horrifying, but so I think one of the things that also I think you see in the data is during the Great Recession, there was a big drop in official reported cases of child abuse, which is kind of surprising. Like, you'd think that everything we know about child abuse is that when people are out of work, that's a big risk factor in child abuse. But you did see, at the same time, you saw the rise in these searches, disturbing rise in these searches of kids making child abuse. And I kind of argue, using a lot of data, that I think what happened is it just became harder to report child abuse, that everyone's kind of overworked, and Child Protective Service Agency became hard to get through. People are on hold lines forever. So it's kind of disturbing that at the same time you see kids making searches, and then the official data, it's like, it go down. Yeah, it was really disturbing, and I'm still kind of talking to them. It kind of like moves a little bit slowly, and I'm not exactly sure how to use this data, but it's kind of a continuing conversation with some of these organizations of how they can incorporate this data. I don't know exactly where it will go, but I hope it. I think it is really important. That is an area where obviously I think the official data can be misleading, and you're not going to get a survey, I think, asking kids this. So I do hope that we can incorporate some of these data sources.
A somewhat similar area where I think the data comes in more slowly than we would like is on is drug addiction data. Right? I think there should be searches that should allow you to figure out where opioid overdoses spike, before the annual CDC data roll in. I think for resource allocation purposes, that kind of stuff could be pretty useful. Let's go over here in the middle. Sorry. I'm trying to make you run around as much as possible. That's the.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name's Todd Wiggins, and I really enjoyed this presentation. So I wanted to ask you, hypothetically, what you see coming down the road in 10 years, because I'm predicting that mind reading is going to be an ever-growing industry. It seems to have developed in my last 20 years from couponing, and you talk about advertising, to modern couponing, which is essentially what we're doing with search engines, right? If you look at it that way. So in 10 more years, we'd want to know more about how people think, not only for aspects of advertising, but for national security purposes or for immigration or whatever we want to apply toward. So where do you see yourself in 10 years, so I know what to invest in right now as far as the stock market is concerned?
Well, I think kind of what you're getting at is that there's a scary element to some of this data. So yeah, we can talk about like the fun things or the important things like child abuse, but the other area is that companies can use this data potentially to take advantage of people. And one study I talk about in the book is a study by Columbia professors of Prosper, a peer-to-peer loaning site. So you apply for a loan and then either get it or don't get it. And they had data on everybody who applied for loans, what they said in their loan application, and then also whether they got the loan, whether they paid back the loan. And they found you could predict whether you'd pay back a loan based on the words you use in the loan application. And some of the relationships were just kind of weird. Like God was one of the biggest predictors. Using the word God was one of the biggest predictors of whether you'd pay back. That if you use God, you were much less likely to pay back, much more likely to default. So like a loan, someone giving a loan would be wise from a profit perspective to not give a loan to anyone who said, God bless you, in their loan application, which is eerie. That's not really how we think of the world. And I think in general, like basically everything that anybody does correlates to some degree with something else they do, right? The correlation between anything is not 0.00000. So like the clothes you wear, the things you like on Facebook, the words you use, everything is going to predict what you might do in the future, and companies can use that to make better predictions of it. And I think the world, we kind of have a legal framework based on this idea that there are like 3 or 4 things companies will know about you, or 10 things they'll know about you, and here are the things the company can't use. So they can't use religion or they can't use race, but you can use these and here's everything you know. And I think we're now entering a world where companies know 1 million things about you, and a lot of them are just put in machines. Like they're not even paying attention to what they even mean. They're just putting correlations in, and I don't think really the legal framework is prepared for that. So.
And the same on the government side, I think. 'Cause I think in the book you mentioned the movie Minority Report. In Minority Report, but I don't know if any of you guys have seen it recently. They have immense processing capabilities in the movie. And they can do calculations really rapidly to predict murders. But they don't have the cloud, so they're constantly carrying these really large hard drives around. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's most of what. I think, is it Tom Cruise? Most of what he does is he takes hard drives out of a wall and he sticks them into different other holes. It's weird. Anyway, but so obviously governments will be tempted to gain access to this very detailed data on citizens and non-citizens and use it to make forecasts. And I don't think there's much of a sense of how that kind of access should be restricted. I think in the U.S., we've long relied on systems not communicating with each other to keep the government from using large data sets that way. In Europe, I think there's much more leeway for governments, and a lot of the systems communicate better. Of course, conversely, Europe has much stronger restrictions on what corporations can do with data, and much stronger privacy protections. And we'll see how those two equilibria will evolve as these things become easier to do. Let's go all the way to the left against the wall.
Jim Sang, this actually follows on your comment about Europe. You mentioned that, of course, Americans tend to be very open on Google in terms of expressing honest opinions. Other countries, of course, in Europe have a much greater sense of privacy. In Asia, of course, in Japan, you have a certain sense of individual distance. In China, you have the Great Firewall. What kind of, how would you characterize responses in countries like China, Japan, Korea, and Germany?
Yeah, so I haven't done as much research in other countries, also because I don't really know any other language, so it becomes really challenging.
Real American.
Yeah, yeah. So it becomes challenging to do it. So I don't know as much. I think it is interesting. So the kind of the premise of a lot of this research in this book is that everyone's really honest on Google, but it isn't necessarily going to stay like that. It may be that I've just been studying this period that people weren't usually honest, and someone did a paper. They compared the searches that people made before and after Snowden's revelations. Did people's search behavior change? And they measured, was there a lower and embarrassing search rates when Snowden's revelation were made? And you found that there was indeed like a drop, like not that big, but a drop. So it could be that in the future people make fewer of these searches. The best part about that paper is they had to categorize
Did
embarrassing.
they find an increase in the number of searches for Snowden?
Probably, yes, presumably. But that's part of the paper, to categorize embarrassing searches. They worked with the Mechanical Turk, and they just started like asking people how embarrassing is this search. And like most of them were like, child porn or like really, really like herpes, like you'd expect. And then one of them that was on there that made the list is Nickelback. And that also dropped apparently after Snowden.
That's pretty good. Let's go over here in the green polo.
Hi, I'm Julian Guinos. I was just wondering, I haven't read enough of the book, so I might be exposing myself for having not finished it, but did you look at all along the lines of the pancreatic cancer example, like what do terrorist mass shooters search right before they commit the crime, and then checking that against what other people searching? Is there like a constellation of things that, everybody who does a mass shooting searches this, but not everybody who searches this does a mass shooting, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I haven't, and I don't think the government may be doing that. I don't know. I don't have access to individual level searches, so I don't know. I think I am kind of a little bit skeptical. Just looking at the absolute numbers, I think people make a lot of horrible searches, like more than you'd expect. That it may just be that the false negative ratio is higher than we'd expect. That a lot of people have bad thoughts more than we thought, and that the government really shouldn't be intervening, not just because of legal and privacy reasons, but just because of data science reasons, that a lot of people are in the same groups and look really, really horrible and never go through with it. So.
Well, I think this relates to the point of questioning whether what someone does that's the most embarrassing is their truest self. I mean, I feel like we have to, you could imagine a super Google of the future that it won't even need you to search. It'll just track all of your thoughts at all times. And then you say, well, then what's your true self? Like whatever thought you had the most frequently, it might have to do with going to the bathroom or whatever, because every once in a while you have to go and it's on your mind. I don't know. I think we just have to be, I don't question a lot of what you found, but again, sort of getting back to the title of people lying, this idea that there is this truth out there, which is what people are really like. I just think we have to watch out about being sort of identifying truth with whatever the current latest technology is.
Yeah, I agree that there are different parts of the self. This actually came up. Tim Wu, I think is a colleague of yours at Columbia. He said that he also brought up this point, and he's like, what's the real you? And he's like, so one of the studies is if you compare searches for gay porn and people who say they're gay, and that in states where it's really hard to be gay, in places like Mississippi or Tennessee, there's a lot fewer people who say they're gay, but there are almost as many gay porn searches. So it seems like a lot of men my reading is a lot of men in places where it's hard to be gay make gay porn searches, but will tell, might be married to a woman, or will tell, or tell Facebook and surveys that they're not gay. And Tim's like, well, are they? My assumption is, okay, that means they're gay. And Tim's like, well, what is that? Does that mean they're gay? Maybe they're not gay if they don't think of themselves as gay. So I don't know. I just thought it's obvious that in that case, that means they're gay, but I don't. But I see Tim's point.
Well, there's something called the tyranny of measurement or labeling. So it's been pointed out, just having the word gay or the expression gay sort of changes things, just the way people can think of themselves as it's not something I do, it's something I am. But also, we talked about this earlier, your example in the book about the efficacy of different schools, and you compare them based on how effective they are in raising kids' test scores or in getting them into top colleges. And those are very measurable things, yet people go to school for other reasons than to get into top colleges and to get higher test scores. So sometimes it's super clear. So some of the clearest examples are these medical examples because the outcome is kind of clear. This is what you want. Or an election, like who's going to win the election. Other cases like Obama's speech or the outcome of a school is tougher because it's not always clear what you can measure. And of course, as a statistician, I don't say don't measure things, but we just have to beware of falling in love with whatever data we happen to have.
Right, but yeah, I agree with that, but I think that one of the good things about this data explosion is now we can tell the richer stories and more complex stories and get these multiple measurements that we used to have. I don't think that the availability of Google searches or Facebook or Twitter or all these things is going to mean we now have fewer things to measure. We now have way more things to measure but I totally agree with you that you have to be careful, not just limiting it to one measurement.
I guess also what you're saying is we have the ability to measure the things that are perhaps a smaller part of the population. No matter what state you are, most men are straight or prefer to have sex with women than with men, but this allows, we can now get in on that specific population that's small, and we can help study that in the way that perhaps a larger survey where you poll 1,000 people, maybe you get 10 or 15 or 20 people who match that description, and there was no real way to tell, X, Y, or Z about them, but now we have a real way to get in on those specific little things.
Let's stay away from more specific levels in this particular area, and let's go to Heidi. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Heidi Tworek. I'm a fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Thanks for the presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I had one observation and then two questions. One is that the health communication stuff is super tricky because if we try to look at how many people are Googling Ebola and Zika, we would imagine that the entirety of the United States is infected with Ebola. So I think that's part of the problem with that kind of stuff. It tells us more about people's fears than it does about their actual symptoms. And then I had two questions that were just related to how representative Google searches really are. So thinking just about the number of Americans who have access to the internet. Only about 85% of Americans have access to the internet, and particularly about 40% of over 65s don't really use the internet. So I'm wondering if you can reflect on how your data on Google searches might be skewed by that 15% of the US population who don't use the internet. And the second question is whether there's been a change over time because of the increase in the number of people who are using apps rather than Google. How far does that skew your data as time goes on?
I think the 15% not using the internet, that'll get smaller and smaller over time. It just kind of gets to the point that this data is not perfect, and it's not going to be 100% correlated with the population. But I think it's pretty.
And you will let the people at Pew worry about that for now.
I think I think the first thing that's striking when you first search Google Trends, and now it's kind of in the public because Harry and everybody else has been using this and showing it, just how powerful the patterns are, and more it could have been. It wouldn't have surprised anyone if Google searches came out and it just was all this noisy, crazy data because it's such a weird data source, and the Bible is searched most in New York and least in Mississippi, or it's all over the place, but it's not the true Bible searched in Mississippi and the Bible Belt totally, and so kind of the data does tend to work as best we can tell pretty well, and will get better over time. I don't know too much about the app stuff. I haven't really looked into it too much, but I think changes over time or long-term changes can be a little tough to measure with this search data. So one thing you see is searches for science went down over time, the percent of searches that include the word science. But and some people have used that as that this is showing that Americans are losing interest in science. But I think just the early adopters of Google were much more scientific interest in science. So I think long-term trends can be very problematic with this data source because of changes.
I want to sort of pick up on your questions because they were kind of critical, and I think that criticism is so essential to making all of this work. Not criticizing Seth's book, but just
which is also important.
a few. So a few months ago, there was something on the internet, and somebody, I guess maybe someone wrote a paper and it got passed around, and they said that people are most religious in the Midwest, not the South. And then there was a lot of cud chewing about what that all meant. And it turned out someone had used some religious data that was a mashup from several different churches. And it turned out that some churches had reported attendance in a different way than other churches. And the data were complete crap. It would have been better to use Google, I'm sure. But I think what happened was people were like, hey, this is hard numbers. Someone's got some numbers. Let's start explaining them, right? And it's one thing that we sort of lack is a great way is a way to sort of engage with these claims. There's a way for people to take a claim and say, this is kind of interesting, or it could be wrong, let's bounce it around. Science can't really do it either. Social science is terrible at doing this. Maybe, I don't know if journalism is better or worse on that, but I think it would. That was what I was getting at earlier, that with the rise of data journalism or Google science or whatever we want to call it, I think this is a great opportunity for us to try to figure out how we can be skeptical without being nihilistic. And I wonder what you all think about this.
You can go first.
Yeah, I definitely.
Then I'll go.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think most of the data in my book is public, and I think a lot of people are obsessed. Andrew blogged about this today, peer review versus data journalism, and I think from my experience writing a data journalism article with which a lot of people, with which maybe 100,000 people or whatever read, is a lot harder than writing an academic paper that 5 of your rivals/buddies read and attack. So I think, I get emails from grad students and undergrads not infrequently critiquing my assumptions and making sense of them. So I think that if we can do a data analysis that is very public, that may be a better way to move this thing forward. And what 538 has to do is they gotta, they really put themselves on the line. They say, they're judged afterwards by how good their predictions are. So that's kind of pretty powerful, and they're always better than, as far as I can tell, better than the other ones.
I will say we get, if I say something wrong, I'll get thrashed for it. My email, my Twitter feed, I don't even know what else. I don't think anyone's tried to call me yet or send me a snail mail. Although a few people have asked me on dates through snail mail. That was interesting. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that this type of, anything that's open, that allows people to get a look underneath the hood and that everyone has an equal opportunity to do so, ensures that the data process and what we claim from the data we're all better off for it, right? Because if I have my secret little data set that I am claiming that I'm making X, Y, and Z from, you have almost no way of checking it. Even from the public polls, the underlying survey data isn't released for 6 months plus on the Roper archive, and there's no real way of checking, and there's no reason necessarily that anyone will give that polling data over. Versus this data, which tends to be a lot more open, that we can get to a lot more quickly, and we can make the determination whether or not this correlation makes any sense, whether or not this data was looked at in the wrong way. And to me, that's very important because there are a lot of people these days who have access to the internet and can write a lot of crazy things and make a lot of crazy claims, and people will believe them. And it is very important to me that we're able to check those people. Now, in some cases, people are going to believe them no matter what. But at least with this type of data, we can check them right on the spot, and anyone who has any basis sort of knowledge who actually wants to figure out what the truth is can do so.
I tend to agree. I think the social sciences have pretty severe weaknesses both in the speed with which review processes work, the accuracy, and just the small numbers in basically every sub area. And I don't think those numbers are always small for good reason, right? It's typically, the 5 people who've written about a very narrow topic before, even though there are many more people who can assess the quality of work, certainly if it's a little more transparent than it typically is. So I think that's helpful. I got phone calls a few times. I wrote about Deflategate one time, And so relatively old men
that doesn't surprise
from
me.
Massachusetts would call to thank me and call me an American hero.
Farmer Ben.
Yeah, that's right. Let's go back to the left here, second table. Yep, there we are.
Thank you. Hi, Joe Schultz with Scripps. One thing that kind of came out earlier in the presentation was being sure to ask the right questions. Another element that I think is important is to ask the right people. And one thing I think is true with polls, with Google, is that it's not necessarily representative. And there's this almost calibration step that we need to make. I think someone mentioned the whole Sanders versus Clinton, Google Trends responses having a much higher response from Sanders. Absolutely. But after a couple of contests and you actually get results, you can calibrate that down and get a pretty good idea how things are going to go moving forward. Similarly with polls, we had pretty big misses, I think, with public polling in Wisconsin and Ohio. A shame. How do you go about making sure that you're able to calibrate your data so that you're able to kind of validate yourself and make sure you're right going forward?
What do you think? So this goes back, I think, to the sample. Sampling quality.
It is a challenge with Google data. With surveys, you can calibrate because you can ask people demographic questions and party identification. And it turned out, as we said during the campaign itself, that a lot of the fluctuations in the polls were clearly attributable to changes in relative non-response of different groups. But I guess with the public Google data, it's more difficult because you don't have people's demographics.
Yeah, I think. The one thing I will say is that I think you're right that the longer this data is around, the more we can calibrate the models and know how to weight them and stuff. With the predicting election thing, you can't really predict an election from the volume of searches that people make because they might be positive or they might be negative. So if people search for Trump, it doesn't really mean they like him. It could mean they hate him. One thing I did find that's reasonably correlated, though definitely not as correlated as polls, is that you can predict which way people are going to go based on the order in which they search the candidates. So like 25% of searches with the word Clinton in it also include the word Trump. So people search for Clinton-Trump polls or Clinton-Trump debate. But if they go Clinton-Trump, you can see that if they go Clinton-Trump polls, they're much more likely to go to, if you do compare that to state level voting, they're much more likely to go Clinton's way. If they go Trump-Clinton, they're much more likely to go Trump's way. So I think things like that, subtle indicators, will probably be predictive. And then as we do more and more elections, we can maybe weight them and calibrate them and figure out whether you can add information to the polls with some of these indicators.
I think we have time for one last question, a quick one, and we're going right here.
Hello, my name is Francois Sims. With the possibility of artificial intelligence bots, do you think that some of these searches could be manipulated?
Well, I think one of the values of Google's search data relative to other sources is that Google has the smartest people in the world working on figuring out who's a bot and taking that out of the data set. So that if the data just came normally, I think a lot of searches are by bots. But Google puts a lot of energy into eliminating those searches because advertisers don't want those included in the data. So it's kind of an arms race between Google and the hackers, but it's a much bigger issue if you just take a random data source that isn't putting the energy into it.
So Google has the smartest bots in the world working on this, is that right?
That's right. All right, and with that, I think we're done here. Thank you, everybody. I think there should be wine and cheese somewhere. Thank you again for coming, and have a good evening.